Thank you so much for coming to our PRCA and Prospect virtual event on managing workplace disruption. My name is Emmer and I'm the co-founder of Prospect. We're the specialist recruitment consultancy within PR and corporate communications. So first of all, many thanks for all of you for attending this webinar. I think we have over 60 people that have dialed in, and we really do appreciate your time. And I hope that you enjoy this discussion on how employees and employers will be totally adapting to a new way of working during and post-COVID 2019. Please feel free to place a question in the Q&A function, which we will address at the end of the session when we open up the floor for questions. Huge thank you to Tara at PRCA for organising this event with us, and of course to our three panellists that I'd like to briefly introduce to you all. Firstly, Emmer Thompson. Emma founded Spurwing 5 years ago and today leads a team of 14 PR consultants, all of which are specialists in healthcare, food and nutrition. And the agency was awarded Best Small Agency to Work For in APAC just last year by Vogt. And Emma brings experience of using communications to shape a positive employee culture from working in a global networked agencies, advising regional comms and HR leads, and building a values-led culture at Spurwing. We also have Marina Vogt. Marina is from Fung Group and is the first Chief Happiness Officer in Hong Kong. She is also a certified applied positive psychology coach, and Marina is the key driver of a new approach to engagement and is very passionate about making happiness at work and kindness a new normal in the workplace. And finally, Ian Rumsby. Ian is at Shandwick. He is the Chief Strategy Officer in Asia Pacific, and he also leads United Minds, which is the agency's culture, transformation and employee engagement consultancy in the region, where he advises clients on a range of issues specific to business transformation, and more recently, the impact of obviously COVID-19 on people, culture and business performance. Ian is also the author of and contributor to Shandwick's global research initiatives on employee activism and country brand building. He chairs the agency's Australian operations and is a former recipient of the PR Week APAC PR Professional of the Year Award. So first of all, I guess I'd like to approach the topic of how are firms communicating and how should they communicate with their employees whilst working remotely? And also to understand if productivity has actually been impacted while teams spend more time out of the office. Now, various studies conducted in the past decades around working from home have shown that there actually is an increase in productivity. One study in China in 2013 showed that working from home led to a 13% performance increase, and Accenture has recently reported a 4.4% increase in productivity as their staff have worked remotely. So my first question, how have organisations changed the way that they have communicated with their employees during the COVID-19 pandemic? Ian, can we hand that over to you?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the invitation to join you, and likewise with my colleagues on this particular panel discussion. I think that obviously there's been a big shift in the way in which organisations are communicating with their employees, and necessarily so. I think we're seeing a lot more empathy, a lot more transparency, but that's quite generic in saying so. And the reality is, organisations, very often they're defined by their leadership, they're defined by their cultures. And so there's clearly a big variation in the way in which that the shift in communications is being seen in different markets. What I think organizations are doing better, but really need to do a lot more of, is to listen very carefully as to what their employees are saying, and to respond to that, and to be seen to responding to that as well. And when I look at the participants on this discussion, this forum today, there's a lot of folks in comms and in HR, and I think what people really have to understand, particularly as we begin to return back to work, is there is this sort of a shift from organizations from a crisis management type function into something which is much more around organizational transformation. And it is because of that you know, there is that sort of switch in the way in which organizations are communicating too. So it's complex. A lot of organizations are doing it differently, but certainly that sort of empathetic level of transparency which is being shown is key.
Okay, thank you. Emma.
Thanks, Ian. To add, I guess, for me, the key thing I've seen is a need for people to trust their employees more.
Yeah.
So yes, everyone is working from home where they haven't transitioned back to the office, but to micromanage is just going to exhaust everybody. You know, you hear of people starting this period with, oh, we have daily Zoom calls with the team, we bring everyone together. And then work has just crept into filling every minute. You know, we're all bouncing from call to call. And we've all, you know, where I've seen companies succeed is where they are trusting people to manage their own time, to juggle what's going on at home. You know, I think there's a huge percentage of this audience that's probably also going through the fun of home-based learning, thinking about what they're doing with their family, and trying to juggle that with the work feeling of, oh, well, now I'm at home and I'm not commuting, I'm always on. We've seen clients shift. The ones that, you know, I really admire are those that have been really open to shift straight to employee-led comms. It's sort of, let's batten down the hatches for, you know, a few days or so and really work out and listen to Ian's point of what our employees need, what they're nervous about. You know, there's job security at risk, there's health worries, and it's the work we've really enjoyed doing with companies is making sure that they're communicating as transparently as possible and being honest that they don't have all the answers. COVID is brand new. We don't know how long it's going to impact the way we live and work. But it's about having an authentic sense of communications and, you know, being honest and saying, bear with us. We'll keep you updated and here are some signposts, but we haven't got all the answers right now.
Because it's also new to everyone, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So how effective have these comms strategies been in maintaining staff engagement? And is this consistent across industries and geographies? Marina, can I ask you that question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. I really look forward to the entire conversation here. I just, you know, wanted to add that, just like, you know, what Ian and Emma said, it's really time for us to pause and listen and create opportunities for people to be able to give feedback and also contribute to the changing times. For us, we've increased the frequencies of live webcasts that we call town halls, really for management to be able to give some sense of kind of comfort around the things that are being, you know, thought through business-wise and also in terms of provisions, and also allowing the feedback to come through live. That was quite important, even though there is a difference between in Asia, say Hong Kong at headquarters, typically we don't get a lot of the questions, but then when the questions come through, it actually resonates with a lot of people. Whereas in the US, you'll see that feedback was very, very important. People working, you know, from home for an extended period of time for the very first time. What are the provisions? What is the protocol? Do we need to meet all the time? I think the comfort came from top management, having that kind of frequent communications with everyone across the board. So that's worked for us.
Okay. Ian or Emma, do you want to share your views on how successful these strategies have been, and particularly across industries and geographies?
Emma?
Sure, Ian?
Just watching me unmuting. So we're focused on APAC, and an industry view, we're specialists in a select number of industries. Healthcare, it's been great. I mean, I've seen some great story sharing, and a lot of the companies and markets, they're trying to share with employees and colleagues on how they're helping governments respond to COVID-19. What is it within their pipelines? What are they working on? How can they pivot manufacturing lines to suddenly produce ventilators or work on a COVID-19 vaccine? And making sure people feel part of that journey, that even if it's not their team working on it, it's the culture and they belong to that company. They're one of the company that is doing its best to help the outside world, and each and every one of us get through and navigate this situation. Mm-hmm. Geography-wise, we've seen very consistent approaches in comms. I mean, there might be different channels, but in terms of frequency that people are communicating and the way they're doing it, the outbound communications is consistent in the markets we're working in.
Okay.
I think we've seen similar as well, and perhaps surprisingly, where this has not worked as effectively for organizations is almost as if they seem to be trying too hard. There's a framework model that's become so immovable that it becomes overbearing. Emma made a very important point earlier that, you know, there is this sense that we're sort of permanently available, bouncing around between meetings. There's a level of vulnerability. There's a sense of, you know, you're living and operating in different environments, very often in different markets. It's less to do with culture of communication and perhaps just more the actual reality of, we've got a lot of people in our business regionally who are living in small properties with a lot of people, and that impacts, you know, a lot of what they do. So I think the environment in which individuals are actually living and working is perhaps as important, perhaps more important than necessarily, you know, we're seeing variations in particular markets. So the culture of communication has changed. Where I've seen things work most effectively, though, is actually when there is this simplicity of communications. When the CEO very often is just using, you know, a device such as this to communicate directly from his or her sitting room on a live feed. That's the stuff that really resonates, because it's that sense of democratization of communications, that sense of we are all navigating this incredibly difficult situation together. It doesn't matter whether you've just joined as an intern or whether you've been running the organization for the last 10 years. It's this sense of vulnerability that everybody has. And so I think we've seen, you know, the simplicity of regular communication where a CEO might speak at the same time every week, and others within the management team, importantly, will also communicate around other issues too. That's the stuff that appears to have worked well.
Okay.
To add to that, I mean, I'm really interested to see how employee surveys come back in the next 6 months or so, to really test that. You know, we all talk about authentic leadership and, you know, bringing your best self to work and etc. But Ian's point about it's leaders showing their vulnerability, and the fact that this has been a complete leveler of, you know, the IT restrictions, for example, or, you know, people getting used to showing themselves every day on Zoom. I'd like to see the scores of how trust in CEOs who did open their home to their employees rather than hide behind, you know, sort of virtual backdrops, how that then follows through to how much trust and, you know, sort of loyalty to the company, that people, you know, will scores go up where people think, actually, I know the person that's leading this organization now. It's not just a figure that could change every 2 years. And we just hear from comms.
The really important part of this, and to build on Emma's point, because it's such an important thing, is this sense of what happens now. You know, we've kind of gone through this period where there's a level of democracy, there's a level of exposure, there's likelihoods of animals walking behind us at any moment in time, as is the case here right now. But how do you retain a level of continuity of that, you know, of that sense of exposure? We've been, in effect, invited into people's homes, into business leaders' homes, into everyone's homes. And I think that the trick for a lot of organizations is you can't just switch that off. And that's going to be a challenge, because as people begin to return to work, there will be this overwhelming sense of so much that needs to be done. And it's too easy to simply say, okay, the CEO doesn't have time to sort of do a live cross from his office anymore. It's not necessary. I think organizations have got to be very, very smart and considered in the way in which they deal with that. This is not about switching off a light switch. It's more of a sort of a, you know, an engine beginning to warm up again. So it's not on and off. It's very much sort of heating down, cooling down, and beginning to heat up as well.
Okay. And what about productivity? Do you feel it's been impacted by staff working from home? Marina, do you want to comment on that about Fung?
Yeah, sure. I think initially, of course, I think this is unprecedented. Nobody really knew what was coming. As soon as we thought, you know, we knew something and then it changed again, it became larger, and, you know, it just kept going. I don't think anybody could be prepared for this. No organization is really prepared. But for us, I think we were very lucky to have spent almost 3 years in this digitization journey where we made the majority of our workforce in the office mobile ready. So in terms of access to systems, and also having, you know, provisions of laptops and smartphones, and so that it was kind of quite easy for us to just kind of jump into a different setting and continue with the access into the same systems. So that's really helped. But then of course the tricky bit is how managers can manage their teams. But you know, and everyone to their own. We've got our own kind of culture of communicating, and it really depends on what the business leaders, you know, kind of activate that during this time. But many of them have actually told us that productivity improved, because if COVID did anything for us, it was to make us stop and pause. We didn't have to travel anymore for business or for pleasure. We didn't have to commute anymore. And so people were actually there. They had no excuse to be anywhere else. So people were actually quite focused and very ready to contribute. So in terms of productivity, it may have actually increased strangely.
Okay. Ian and Emma, any comments on productivity that you've noticed?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm skeptical about these sorts of research results around productivity, but I think you've really got to, you know, get into the weeds on these sorts of things. As Marina has said, there is a fair amount of any productivity lift that is a consequence of the logistical benefits of people not actually having to commute anymore. And in a lot of different markets, that's a big, big deal. It is, as we've already said, a big, big deal because there's that sense of, you know, does that mean that people are expected to work, if you will, longer hours? But I think the productivity question, particularly in our industry, it's so dependent upon the individual. Introvert, extrovert, is that individual has a tendency to be more productive when surrounded by others, when working with them. You know, the creative experiment of, if you will, creativity on your own or through Zoom, it's incredibly challenging. I mean, there's a whole bigger issue around productivity and what actually, you know, is productivity grounded in the number of minutes that people are working every single day, or is it actually grounded in the value that's being delivered as a consequence to the business? So I think
let's hope it's the latter, but yeah.
Well, that's for another session. But I mean, I think it's a complex area, this point about productivity. We've seen dips in productivity. We've seen raises in productivity as well. Many factors are built into where they're up and down. The important point for business leaders or anyone who's managing teams of people is that they map it very carefully, and that they also expect and anticipate drops in productivity when people are still working at home, for the simple reason there are just some days that people don't, you know, they just don't want to be in this environment anymore. That has a material impact on the way in which people are feeling. So we're certainly going to see dips and raises, and I think as people come back into work, you'll see productivity highs, and then you'll see falls, and then, you know, that kind of W effect almost in terms of the return to work. So there's a lot of variables behind productivity that go way beyond, you know, the statistics.
Okay.
If I may add just one point here, is that I'm sure we'll cover a lot more on what we've done for well-being. Last year, we actually did a big campaign around health and well-being, and this year in 2020, this is the time to flex that and to make that reality. It was really quite powerful when our CEO of the trading company was able to talk about the challenges of sleep, and to be able to take care of yourself, and to pause and to really take a break from all that's going on, because it is really tough. And there are, you know, units where they cannot function because factories are closed. And so if you have that language in the culture, and you're able to kind of implement, you know, that into everything that you do, all the way from the CEO down to comms and internal comms, it actually helps.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to what is going to be the new normal of working. So how are organisations managing the complexity of a return to work corporate directive when many countries across the region and the world are obviously at very different times of their return? In Hong Kong, I feel that we are, you know, we're pretty much back to the office. Clearly in Singapore, it's a very different story. So, Ian, should we start with you? And what have you seen have been the ways in which to manage this?
It's been interesting, and different companies have had to deal with it in very different ways. We're doing some work at the moment with an organisation that's Singapore-based, and it has its headquarters in a Northern European country. Singapore government is obviously encouraging people, I believe, you know, to stay at home, to work from home. They see the productivity lifts in doing that. The view of the organisation globally is that culture and commerce is far better, you know, seen when people are actually working in the office together. So there's this sort of push to get people back in the office, but a local resistance saying, well, who do I follow? And this point was made earlier about sources of truth and trust. The challenge for organizations now is how do you transition trust from sources, very often which is government-based, to something which is organizational-based. And it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's more often than not a combination of both. But this point about how have organizations treated their employees, which Emmer has rightly made, begins to allow an organization to deal with, you know, this is why we believe you need to return to work. The really nice example of how an organization communicated around this very issue was actually, they didn't talk about how many people they wanted to see back at work. They talked about how few people they wanted to see back at work. And the outcome was exactly the same, but the message was one of, again, empathy and a recognition that a lot of people didn't necessarily want to be back or were under local directives not to be back. So it was a case of, we believe that the organization will move forward more effectively, be able to support its customer needs and its employee needs when we have a small and manageable number of people back in the office. And then, you know, it's built from there. So it's a really tricky one. And I've been surprised and a little bit frustrated that some global corporates, you know, whether it's US or European, have not been more sensitive to local needs. There are many good examples, but there are a surprising number of organizations that haven't necessarily met this one well.
Emma, do you want to add to that?
No, I agree with Ian. I mean, I'm working and speaking from a country where we are absolutely told it's stay at home. We've now moved to phase 2 of a lifting of lockdown without any idea of when phase 3 might come about. And we even, you know, as someone guiding my own employees through this, we're just having to say, you know, we're under the directive of our local governments. We can't even, you know, say to people, we'd like you to go back. We're just adopting and adjusting to, okay, well, perhaps it will be August, perhaps it will be team A versus team B. We just don't know. But, you know, us and our clients have to help their employees through that uncertainty. And I think coming back to that peaks and troughs of productivity and the emotion, like we're all human at the end of the day. We don't love being locked in our own homes, not having a switch off, even if it is a 10-minute walk from the office to home. I think that helps people find the line between, okay, now I can be myself and switch off. And that's what, you know, we have to Marina's point about well-being and the importance of that in helping teams through this and making sure that HR and communications are working hand in hand to support employees is going to be really important.
Absolutely.
So I just have to hope, like all the clients sitting in the APAC headquarters here in Singapore, you know, they're trying to come to us and we're thinking about what do we put in an employee, you know, communications toolkit for people sitting in Australia, for example, or Hong Kong who are back to work, and making sure that we're not just writing from the Singapore and our current status.
Okay. You mentioned about well-being, and I guess working in this new normal may put increased pressure on people. Do you think this pressure is going to come from employers? What will employers expect from their employees in this different way of working? Marina, do you want to kick off with that?
Yeah, I think there's an increased pressure on both sides to be able to be agile, truly agile, be able to change and embrace change. I think the real question really is, how can employers, what can employers do to nurture their talent pool and to help them develop so that you're able to kind of come together and along this journey. Surely this is not the last crisis that we're going to see of this scale. It's very important that the employers are able to extend a hand to say that we're going to help you develop. We're also kind of embracing a mindset of change and embracing change so that we can continue our business. So I think it falls on both sides.
Ian or Emma, any comment on sort of what employers will expect from their employees?
I think it's going to be a tricky one. I think employers are going to find themselves under quite a bit of pressure of, answering the question. If they are trying to take a stance of, right, everyone back to the office, it's business as usual. There's going to be a lot of pushback on, well, everything is, accessible from home. We've proved that. And for you might have, an employee saying, for my well-being, I do want to work from home 2 or 3 days a week. I can be productive. I've shown you that. I think there's going to be tricky. There'll be pressure coming the other way more than employers on employees. I think employers need to be careful that they're not trying to be sort of too onerous on what they expect from employees in coming back. I think there is a huge mental health issue to come out of this. People worried about their health, about their families, about, probably family members losing jobs, etc. I think that's a big wellness issue. We've got people through the adjustment to working from home, but how do we help them adjust to the new normal?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this point about wellness and a whole range of mental health issues, we might address that a little later, but it's such an important point. And I don't think with the work that we've been doing with organizations that, whether they're large or small and irrespective of market, I'm not seeing much evidence of organizations really preparing for and accommodating that. Where I think, to sort of summarize some of these points, I think the issue in part is that organizations are almost trying to, simulate life before COVID in their return to work, and to this, whether we call it a new normal, whatever it might be. There's this new language that's immersed around social distancing. I don't think it's social distancing at all. I think social distancing is not as a term so much as is the biggest challenge. It's actually spatial distancing that's required. But this concept of, let's just work hard for the next 6 months until we get back to something which feels a little bit more normal. That's a problem, because it will skate over these bigger issues around health, well-being, and frankly, I think the whole social contract between the employer and the employee has changed. Employers need to expect people looking to operate in different ways. And the fact is that the speed of transformation that we've seen, particularly around digital transformation and use of technologies, has been so rapid, it's so dramatic, that it would be extremely surprising to find the majority wanting to just sort of head back to the office as normal. I think we'll see a spike, but I think, as I've said earlier, I think we'll also see a lot of people beginning to fall away and reevaluate, how do they, what is the nature of their relationship with their employers? So employers need to accommodate that sort of thinking to ensure that they're able to manage what the future looks like.
And Emma, I think you mentioned earlier that obviously people have now proven to their employers that they can be productive, do their jobs from their home. And which is great, because obviously in Asia, as we all know, that's been really hard to prove. And I think, in the UK, for example, lots of people work flexibly. But I think in Asia, that's been a lot more challenging. But because of this, do you now see that there could be more part-time, flexible working opportunities post-COVID? Now that we've shown that this actually can be successful. And do you think also we'll now be shifting towards maybe hiring more freelance or contract staff rather than permanent employees?
Yeah, I would definitely hope that we see more flexibility in ways of working. I would caution, I don't know that we'll see a lot more part-time people, because we haven't overcome, if people had worries about, well, can you still fulfill, the role that we need to fulfill in less hours, for example. But definitely a flexibility of, I would actually like to be home to drop my child to school and then start the day at 9 a.m. I think that's, it's going to have to be a tough employer who says, no, that doesn't work we're going back to the old normal where employers took a firm line and said, you must be in an office. I think, and Ian's point on the spatial distancing, if there isn't the water cooler chat, if there isn't, natural interaction between each other, then some employees are going to push back and say, I can probably get a lot more done at home. So I'd like that. I'd love to say, the thing about using freelancers, I don't know that there's going to be a huge uptick in using freelancers. I think there's still, and I think we'll talk about onboarding, there's still a culture and a team feel to build, and that can be built with employees joining as full-time staff. But what I would say is that it's going to be a lot easier to get people thinking about using freelancers when, the talent pool is tight, but you might know someone that could help you in a short period of time. You've got all the tools set up. They could work wherever they are. Maybe now is the time for these collective agencies we see around the world of great PR talent that just doesn't happen to be sitting here in APAC, and using them for particular roles. You don't need to be sitting in my office in Singapore to access files or, understand the way that we work. We can have a video call or even a normal telephone call.
God forbid, a telephone call.
Sorry,
Ian.
there's a couple of organisations we're working with at the moment, and they're posing this acutely important question, which is, what is the purpose of the office? And I think they're beginning to gravitate towards their office being something which is almost akin to, where you would hold off-site sessions, those sorts of sessions which relate to, big strategic thinking or whatever it might be. It causes big questions around how do we create teams, how do we create cultures? And so it's not as simple as, again, that switch on, switch off, but people are really and truly reimagining what the office environment could look like. And indeed, what a service structure might look like as well, whether it's through bringing in people not as full-time employees, but with specialist skills. There is a lot of very, very good talent that's going to be in the market moving forward, one-person bands. And I think the level of consumer and business confidence means that there is a possibility that in the first, let's say for the sake of argument, to year end, that absence of a sense of what's going to happen in 2021 means that there may be a reluctance to bring talent on full time, but instead to bring talent into the organization, on a project basis. I don't know, but I would not be surprised if we did see some evidence of that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think we've already seen a little bit of an uptake on that, which, again, has been quite a new thing in Asia. The general consensus for employers is to hire on a permanent level. But we're definitely seeing more freelance project work coming through. And obviously that's also going to be down to the fact that firms are going to be really tight on budget. And therefore they're not going to have the budget to hire a permanent employee necessarily. So I think this could be a really good thing. Sorry, Emma.
Sorry, I think just with what you're saying, it comes back to this, there is a huge uncertainty over how long and how much of an impact this is going to have.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So you're seeing a return of the contract role?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and but I do also think that's down to the fact that companies are not going to be able to afford a permanent headcount, and they are still going to be short-staffed, need more resource, and a freelancer or a one-man band is a perfect option. Let's talk more now about the needs of the employees. And obviously, we operate in an industry that typically is a young industry. I think the average age is 28. And so some of the characteristics of this industry is, we attract young people to come into a fast-paced, dynamic, team-driven environment where they're all together. You've mentioned obviously before about creativity. How easy is that to do from your room at home? So, and also you mentioned, Ian, about the office environment. So how will these new ways of working cater to people who thrive in that office environment and need that, versus people who actually prefer to work remotely? And will people that choose to work remotely miss out, or will they be overlooked if they're not with their teams in the office? I think juggling that is going to be pretty challenging. Any comments on that? Marina, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think we just have to acknowledge that this change has changed us, all of us, profoundly in the way that we work, the way that we perceive workplace, and even work ethic. I think, both Ian and Emma have already spoken about culture. I really do think that it comes down to the culture that you have built and you'd like to sustain. For us, we were actually quite adamant about being flexible even while returning to work, because there are different levels of comfort and there are different needs from different business leaders, whether or not they needed people back in the office or not. And just to continue to have that flexibility is very important, and to ensure that we have an inclusive workplace where we address people's different levels of comfort, about distance, about wearing a mask in the office or eating together, or the provisions. I think that really needs, to be addressed. But, just going back to the culture, surprisingly, through the very, very hard hit time, we have this kind of like a Twitter feed on our internal comms portal called LF Feed. And suddenly we saw from the Philippines, people were doing like cheer up challenges on TikTok, nothing but just to cheer people up across the globe, because everyone was just staring into like, what's the new announcement? Can we go back to work? Are we supposed to be off? And then we also had teams, smiles, kind of sending smiles. So somebody from the UK started that, and just sending off smiles, and somebody else then would, can carry that on. And then big teams of 30 people, they were joining like Zoom or Teams video call art, where they made hearts and roses, all with it just to cheer people up across the globe. And we had so many phone calls also from Hong Kong and China to our US counterparts to say, you know what, we've lived through this, we've just reopened, it's difficult, and here are the ways that we're managing our teams, and hope is out there. And it's just so important. And the last thing I'll share about this, I'm just over the moon that it happened organically. We didn't tell anybody to do it. And certainly we, from the engagement point of view, we didn't start a campaign to do smiles, but it happened organically. And it really speaks to the work that we've kind of, laid last year. The last thing that I'm super chuffed about is the pantry of sharing in Thailand, in our logistics center. So, hardships around the ASEAN region, and people, not having access to food sometimes. And of course, we've done, our COVID response, but people just kind of parked food. They found a cabinet somewhere in a warehouse and just kept sharing, and then they shared back with the company. I think that sense of sharing and support and it's just something to keep for a long time.
Absolutely, that's fantastic. What about what can we expect in terms of employee behaviour and level of comfort with physical interactions during this reopening phase? Because like I think, Marina, you were saying, wearing masks, not wearing masks? Are people like greeting each other, wanting to hug? Others are like, oh my God, don't go anywhere near me. You know, surely everyone's got different views on how behavior should be. Are there any particular flags that we should look out for when finally returning to work?
Well, I think it sort of comes back to some of these points about needing to listen and be you know, sufficiently sensitive to different people's needs. There's a responsibility that every organization has, and that is to, you know, to ensure the health and safety of its employees. And some of those employees will be more vulnerable than others, whether it's to age or anything else. So really the first thing that an organization has to address is to ensure that employees understand that the infrastructure in their workspace is, you know, is safe. And I think as you sort of begin to, once you've established that, then what you're seeking to build is a re-established connection with the employee base, to feel, okay, I as an employee feel that my leadership is listening to me, that they are responding to the needs, that I have a platform and opportunity to actually share those responses as well. And that there's some flexibility. I mean, some of these lovely, you know, ideas, whether it's Smile or the Smile campaign from or initiative that was prompted by people within the organization. We're seeing a lot of that. There's some great stuff that organizations are doing. It's quite structured, and, you know, we as an agency do some really, really good things. That we have this regular weekly session called We Solve Together, and it's people from right across the business sharing, you know, a passion of theirs, whether it's everything from yoga to operatic singing. Today we had Australian rules football in Japan, which was an interesting one. But it's actually the smaller stuff that, you know, that just bubbles up that people really connect with. So I do think, and one thing we haven't necessarily addressed yet, but I think the bit that's in part missing here is that as organizations, whether it's agencies or whether we're talking about, you know, larger corporates and our clients, there's this enormous effort to address employee needs. But the most relevant thing for most employees is actually the nature of the work they do. So much of the communications we've had with employees, or organizations are having with employees, is around, you know, the future of the business, you know, some good stuff, some difficult stuff, all of these sorts of things, to the point that every time, you know, the CEO speaks, it can be a little bit unnerving for some people. The reality is, certainly when it comes to public relations, communications and marketing, people join an organization like ours because they want the opportunity to do some amazing work. And it's so important, not just in public relations agencies, but for any organization, that we begin to refocus back on the quality of what people are actually doing and what they're actually delivering, whether it's to their clients and customers. So it's important for comms folks on this call that we don't lose sight of the fact that we need to celebrate and recognize good work as much as we do have to address some of the bigger issues that the organization might be facing, whilst at the same time, you know, allowing these really cool and nice ideas to flourish across the organization to help culture too.
Mm-hmm. Emma, anything you want to add to that in terms of flags that we should all look out for?
Not a flag per se, but I would just come back to what we said at the beginning, that to get through this and make sure that we are listening to all employees, we need to ask them,
yeah,
how do they want to come back to work? Share their fears, share their excitement. Some people literally just want to come back because there's some great, you know, it's an occasion to go out to lunch and meet friends who work in other offices, and, you know, there is a social element outside of our immediate office, but, you know, we're placed in the CBD. People come together in different office buildings, and people want to catch up with friends. We've been in a period of, you know, sort of only seeing, you know, a couple of members of family that we live with. Then I think if you make it a very, you know, open way of asking, to say that there's no right or wrong answer, we just need to know how people feel.
Yeah.
Then employers will be able to make sure that they're sort of listening and adopting and implementing the right practices. But it can't be done, you know, with sort of HR only adhering to a government guideline.
No. Okay. Marina, I mean, would you like to share some tips on how you feel everyone can protect and promote mental well-being? Because I think everybody here has said what a big issue it is and going to be.
Yeah, it's such a delicate matter. You do need to kind of cater to, various different needs, but I think it's very important for organizations to have that as top of mind, to have their EAPs ready, and also be able to walk the talk, actually. So if you talk about caring about your employees' health and well-being, you need to be able to show for that. And even with remote work, we were able to offer webinars from experts, say Mind Hong Kong, and open that up to the region. So we're able to do many different things on resilience as well, mindfulness practice, how to lead through COVID, not to kind of miss out on the managers as well, because the managers are equally suffering, and of course, in addition to all the healthy tips that you'd like to share in terms of nutrition, sleep, exercise, all of those things, but to really be like what Ian started with, be empathetic towards the different needs, because if you want to talk about emotional and mental well-being, you just need to be able to address many different things and be able to have, to be able to reach out to say that we've got the support system ready and we're here to hear you out, and here are the things that we can try to offer you, but continue to let us know what you need. I think that being open to that conversation is very important, and it's not easy to do, but at least we need to start, and this is the perfect moment to begin if you haven't.
And who needs to have that conversation? Because like Emma just said, this doesn't need to come from HR guidance that have been given by the government, for example. Who needs to be having these conversations? Does it need to be coming from the top to employees?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You just have to, I don't think we can afford to be misaligned anymore. In this day and age, I think any kind of divergence of what your brand stands for, you'll be caught. So alignment and collaboration between HR and management and comms, internal comms, all of it has to be consistent. You have to carry through that in terms of brand consistency and also messaging. So if health and safety of your people are top of mind, if you're a priority, you have to be able to walk the talk. So everyone needs to be able to offer something on that note.
Yeah, there's more and more evidence of ambassador or change champion programs being sort of reactivated during this period as well, because I think this point about where does the message come from? Absolutely, to Marina's point, it's got to be absolutely consistent, a complete alignment between internal, external, consistency as to what's coming from different sources in a more formal fashion, but in a slightly less formal fashion, which is really where so much of information comes from. It's where those sort of change champion and ambassador programs come to life. And what that means for organizations, it's providing just some specific briefings for those involved in those sorts of teams, if you will, so that they cascade that sort of the right language, the right messages through the organization, and also identify where there may be particular challenges emerging. Because I think a very important part of this actually relates to employee activism as well. That being, where are there threats to the organization? Most are trying to do what they can, and some employees may not feel that that's necessarily enough. So, your best laid plans can be turned upside down very, very quickly if suddenly an employee or ex-employee becomes publicly vocal about certain approaches the organization is taking. So there's such a complexity here. And I think for many organizations, we're getting close to a point now where if organizations don't have clear plans, or at least scenarios where they have identified where opportunities, consistency and alignment in communications, threat, activism, all of that, it's, if they haven't got that sorted out now, it needs to happen very, very quickly, because otherwise they're going to be tripping over themselves, just simply because there's so much to do.
Okay. So with the shift in the way people work and these new working environments, traditional ways of building teams and fostering company culture may need to be re-examined. So let's talk about culture. How is office culture changing? And what does that mean to existing staff as well as new staff coming into the organisation? Emma.
Culture, if I think back on how we have engaged our team, we've tried to do as much team gathering as we would have done even if we were all in the office. And that has definitely been a huge boost in morale. Like we see, you know, people, it goes a bit flat when you're just talking to people on client calls on Zoom all day, because there isn't that chance to have a personal, how are you? So we brought in things like virtual team coffees. It's no obligation. It doesn't matter who shows up. This morning, there were 6 of us on the call, all completely different levels. Sometimes there'll be 10, sometimes there'll be 2, but it's just about making sure people have that chance to be themselves in front of us as well, and in front of each other. On onboarding, we are actually hiring more staff, and we've taken this time through COVID to really look at how we onboard people, because it's got to be as robust as ever. It's got to be supercharged to make sure we get someone and we help them understand who a Spurwing person is. So we're going through all sorts of new tools and Trello boards to make sure that we share our vision and our values, and think about how we drip feed that throughout, say, a 3-month probation period as well. Things like reviews are still as important as ever, but we're going through mid-year reviews, and it's a chance for, you know, people to understand that we are here to say, this is not the playing field we thought it was going to be when we set these goals in November last year, but we still want to get the best out of you this year. So how do we adjust them, and how do we make sure that, you know, given the sort of, and it's not restrictions, I think, to me, I've seen a brilliant uptick in not just productivity, but the capability of our team, because they've been trusted and they've responded so well to it that actually we could probably change some goals to push them a little bit harder for the next 6 months. But then there's going to be things like new business targets and things that you've just got to be realistic. You know, this isn't in their control. Yeah, so culture building, I see it in client groups as well. They're using their intranet channels differently, you know, and the engagement has gone where we've had conversations before of, oh, we've had Yammer, but now it's just died a death because no one's using it. Suddenly you've got that management at the top sitting at home, not on flights, and they are, you know, finally listening to if it's led by the top down, you'll get the whole team behind you. And they've got more time to set that culture themselves and build it.
Okay, Ian?
Bit of a jumpy answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think most organizations are in effect onboarding everybody that they employ right now.
Right.
And, it's almost that approach, that structured approach to bringing in a new member of a team, who they're working with, whether they have a buddy system, you know, all of those sort of more classic systems of onboarding people. In some regards, I think we need to think very carefully about how you deploy similar approaches to everyone, because for the reasons that we cited about, you know, I'm a big believer that, as I've already said, that I think organizations have put far more focus on and recognition around shifts in consumer behavior than they have necessarily in employee behavior. I was talking to a client in the banking sector, one of the big commercial banks, earlier in the week, and you know, he said, a colleague of his, he said, I don't recognize him anymore, not physically, but just emotionally. He's a completely different individual. There's almost this sort of discomfort. So we really need to think, I think organizations have got to think very, very carefully about how everyone returns into to the organization. As far as new staff is concerned, there's a couple of things to consider, most of which actually Emma's addressed. The mentor program, or a mentoring structure, is as important as it ever could be. An individual needs to have somebody, not just a line manager, but somebody who can really give them the lay of the land, to give them some direction as to where you source information. Because as an individual comes into an office environment, they're, you know, like an amoeba, they are absorbing a huge amount just from listening to what's happening around them. And that's obviously extremely difficult in this particular situation. So, you know, we've got to be very, very aware of that, and also to make sure that they understand where the platforms of information are, where they can actually access information too. So for me, you know, the onboarding piece is the classic and traditional means of bringing people into the organization is super important. But I do think organizations need to behave in a way that they're you know, onboarding everybody right now.
Do you think it's going to take individuals longer to sort of be part of the team because they're remote?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable. But I also think that when people are joining an organization at this stage, they have a certain level of expectation as well of, you know, it's going to be difficult. There are, in some markets, there are obviously opportunities for an individual to meet face-to-face with people. So it's going to be challenging. The one thing which I think is, which organizations have to be particularly sensitive to, is that we've seen evidence of organizations who on the one hand are having to let people go, and on the other hand are bringing in people usually in specialist functions. That cost me, that's a real challenge, because you'll be very, very careful about how you communicate the onboarding of people, or the introduction of people into the organization, if at the same time, through whatever circumstances, other people are having to leave the organization. Companies can fall down very, very quickly on that, and all of this discussion around trust and sources of truth evaporates when something like that happens.
So how can firms engage and communicate more effectively and sensitively then when with employees, just when those types of things are happening in the company? Like you say, people are coming and going. How is a firm supposed to manage that in the best possible way?
Do you want me to? I mean, different organizations are going to do it in different ways. I mean, I think, again, it keeps coming back to this point around transparency. The fundamental message, I think, for most organizations is this, you know, decisions are being made and steps are being taken to protect the interests of the company and those who are employed within it. It is a long-term decision as to do that. The second part of really many of the kind of the approaches that organizations are taking, rightly, is to say we as a business are having to change. We are having to bring in a new type of talent to be able to deliver a service to customers that we hadn't necessarily needed to do. You've got, and that's very genuine as well. It has to be genuine. But you know, if you look at digital transformation agendas, what many organizations were looking to do in a matter of, you know, in 2 years, some have done in 2 weeks. And if your business is adapting and changing and shifting that dramatically, then you have to bring talent into your organization that can help move you forward in that direction. At the same time, you've still got these, you know, difficult decisions to make about some people whose roles are not necessarily as required, if you will, as perhaps they may have done in a previous model. So it's really difficult, but it needs to be clear, it needs to be honest, and it needs to be absolutely transparent as well. And I think when people understand the rationale for these incredibly difficult decisions that organizations are making, then they tend to be more pragmatic and understanding of it. It's, you know, bringing somebody on is difficult. Letting somebody go is incredibly difficult. Doing those two things at the same time, that's complicated.
Emma, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you've just reminded me of the Airbnb situation, Ian, and the letter I read from the CEO. I think if people are looking for examples of some great comms, you know, Airbnb, they were talking about, it's a CEO letter, it's public, but how they had obviously brought in some great talent and probably some expensive talent as they were trying to expand and grow into, you know, away from the traditional room sharing or sort of standard private flat let into, you know, specialist retreats, etc. And he wrote a great letter that I read at the beginning of COVID of, you know, travel has turned on its head. There isn't a business model for Airbnb right now. Perhaps it is opening up in, I think, the UK, people are allowed back on staycations, but it's going to be a very slow return. But in that letter, he said, but we have to keep on some of those people because, you know, talent is hard to find. And they'd gone through the journey of onboarding them, finding them, interviewing them, making sure that they were right for Airbnb, and they will be right for the Airbnb that returns to normal when we can all travel, or we can even, you know, go on staycations. But he handled it really well in that clear, to Ian's point, it was clear. He wasn't hiding anything. He wasn't saying, look, we're letting you go, but we're not going to talk about those really expensive people in the corner. It's, we are still future-proofing our business, and we would be naive to let, you know, that specialist talent leave the organization now. However, we can't sustain a business because the roles that the people who are leaving are, you know, going from, there isn't a need for them at the moment. And it's probably, you know, lots of, I don't know, like even like listing relationship managers and things like that. Yeah, so it stuck with me when I read it. And I think the Grab CEO also did a great open letter recently along the same lines. There are some great people to look at for inspiration, but the thread that runs through it for me is that they just keep it open. They're not scared that an employee is going to share it publicly. They just put it on their website. Yeah. They don't have anything to hide in that employee email.
So it's all about transparency, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we should go to our Q&A because I'm aware of time and I can see some questions coming through. Amanda or Alyssa, do you want to head through those questions?
Yes, sure thing. Hi everyone. This is Amanda from Prospect. I'm a director with the Singapore office working with Emmer and Alyssa in Asia. I hope you all agree with me that there was some really interesting and useful points raised during the discussion. And we've had quite a few questions come in, which is fantastic. And we'll try to get through as many as we can. So to kick off, I think we've got two questions on the topic of over communication, right? So the first one being, how do you address the problem of over communicating to your employees? And then the second one, which is, you know, related, how do you address CEOs who have been scared of over communicating, considering today any communication that takes place internally has a risk of becoming external when employees share, you know, those emails outside the organization. Would anyone like to address these questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to step in on, yeah.
Maybe Marina?
Over communicating, we absolutely saw some clients, yeah. I think if I take one example, the multinational, the APAC HQ is here in Singapore, but global, so the US headquarters was giving directives overnight and over weekends saying, you know, it was their Friday, suddenly it's Singapore Saturday, you're not coming back into the office. So people have gone home. No, you know, it was utter headless chicken territory at the beginning of the remote working. And we had a client call us and say, look, IT is putting something out, HR is putting something out, the building security is putting something out, please help. And we just said to them, you need to strip this right back, make it visual friendly. These are human beings at the end of the emails. Think about infographics or just a simple video to say, you know, these are the steps, this is what you need to do. And I mean, I don't see so much over communication anymore. I think the change, we went through a phase of, you know, countries were at different stages of lockdown. It was all happening fairly quickly. It's got definitely calmer. And people, I think, have the confidence to say, we don't know what is around the corner, but we are following government X's guidelines and we will keep you updated. What worked with our clients was thinking about infographics that could be easily translated, that could be, you know, sent around markets overnight and updated, and just videos, making sure that people felt that there was someone at the end of the line listening to them and having their best interests at heart. Ian, do you want to take the CEO question or anything I've missed out? Way too much communications.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to what you were saying, because I think I think we all reached a point where if we received another piece of correspondence that said, you know, it started off by saying, in these challenging times, there was a lot of people were making a lot of things up, not in terms of information or content, but just how do you navigate communicating around this? And I don't think people were necessarily deliberate enough. They weren't consciously communicating. There was more focus on content than there was necessarily cadence of content. And that, as Emma has said, has we've seemed to have got into a rhythm now. Most organizations have got into a rhythm. But this point about over communication it's a very fine balance, because if you over communicate, people switch off. If you under communicate, you create a vacuum which other people will fill, which is equally, terrifying in some instances. So being regular, being specific. I think this point about infographics is a great example of how organizations are doing that well. Likewise with video content as well. We just need to, we've got to communicate more as humans almost. And if COVID has done anything, it's perhaps just stripped back perhaps the over corporatization of some forms of communication, where we're dealing with people in their homes in a different way. As far as this question on CEOs are concerned, how do you address CEOs been scared off? How do you address them? I think the best way of answering that is the challenge for all of us is to connect culture with commerce. A CEO is responsible for a lot of things, but primarily it's the long-standing, the performance and value creation of that organization. He or she has come to learn of the value of culture, and there's been a huge learning curve, if you will, for many CEOs who've been leading this particular charge. They've become particularly reliant on their communications function, which is good for all of us, but it's important to see as well. But this kind of cadence of communications, if you will, this relationship between, if I can get my culture right, then my business is going to perform better, or at least I'll give my business a better chance of performing better. That for me is what is key. If you have a CEO who either doesn't believe in the level of communication that the comms lead will be recommending, or perhaps on the flip side of that is too keen to over communicate. So keep driving home that message about the relationship between culture and commerce.
Marina, would you like to add to that in terms of your experience? I mean, do you have a CEO who's afraid of over communication, or the fear that information might be leaked outside the organization? Is that something that keeps them up at night?
I'm sure many CEOs have different fears and can't sleep as well as in 2019. But I think for us, we actually, the crisis management team over these past few months have been working very, very closely. And there was an agreement about keeping to the drumbeat of having regular communications and where and when things were being communicated in terms of, building facilities, provisions, safety, hygiene measures, whatever, comes from one kind of section, and the CEO's sole job is to address the entire company and to take them and talk about business progress or whatever else it is, and just to calm the nerves as well a little bit. So I think for us, it's been very regular. As an employee, I felt that I knew, what I was able to do when working from home, and also what was expected of me while coming back to the office from one section of the platform. And I looked to the CEO for messaging in terms of business progress and all those things.
Great. So our next question is on authentic communication. So the emphasis on authentic and transparent communication is stronger now than ever before. From a comms perspective, could we hear some examples of how companies are doing well, and how some leaders and managers are demonstrating that either by proxy or virtually? Who would like to go first? Maybe Ian?
Sure. I mean, I'll be very quick because I've provided this example before, but the most effective use of authentic and transparent communications is from a CEO who uses his mobile phone once a week, same time, from his living room or garden, and talks to his people about the business. And that has landed so well because as I said earlier, it is a wonderful and respectful means of simply saying we are all experiencing the same thing. We just have a slightly different role in the way in which we're dealing with it.
Got it. Great. Does anyone want to add anything to that answer? No. Okay, we'll move to the next point. We've got a couple of comments from Sai Did It. Thank you so much. Did you have a question you wanted the panelists to address? Because it sounds like it's comments. Let's maybe move to the next question on keeping leaders focused on the big picture. What are some tactics we can recommend to leaders or our clients to help employees keep focus on the big picture and not, just kind of thinking about the current challenging environment?
Again, I'll be quick on this because I know the other guys will have something to say. But the best means of doing that I've seen a CEO take, and it's always the simple stuff. His view was that as he was communicating and talking to his people, particularly around some structural shifts in his organization that actually were pre-COVID, is he made an absolute commitment to talk to people about their impact, not their role. In this instance, it was it's a manufacturing company, and so the focus on the guy who was building pallets and the impact of him doing such a great job was as important as somebody leading a sales or marketing function as well, and the importance of her, the contribution that she would make. So focus on impact, not just role. And I think that people will respond for the simple reason that they have a sense of their contribution to the organization. If you can get people to realize and recognize how their role contributes, then that is far more important than just whatever the role might be. Yeah, I think, sorry, it's like right on cue. I have been interrupted by a dog and a child. It's about, for me, it's making sure that people understand they have a job that has value post-COVID. I mean, you couldn't script this. This is authentic.
I can add to this as well. I think for one of our town halls, or actually the first few town halls, they're more memorable. One of the presidents actually took the time to name teams across the company and across streams and business units for how they were able to come together, to collaborate, to make something that seemed impossible a while ago really possible, and made an impact for the business and operations. And also then, it's about incentivizing the right kind of behavior that you could, during these, unprecedented times, behave a certain way and do kind of cross collaboration that you might not have been accustomed to. So that's something that's worked for us as well.
One other thing that it's made me think that combines all of this is we've seen some clients implement, and we've worked with them on putting together motivational e-bulletins of cross-sharing, especially in healthcare. It's a client that is working on a vaccine for COVID-19, but there are thousands of people within that organization that have nothing to do with that vaccine. But where they've seen employee engagement scores rise is where they've shared, stories, tips and tricks on how people in the company have pivoted to engage with their customers in a different way, and the results. It's very difficult to get in front of a doctor, for example, at the moment, if you're trying to sell a high value new drug that has nothing to do with COVID or respiratory infections. And yet they've, just sharing in a very simple 3-paragraph email, I think it is, but just, here's what we did. This was the challenge. We came up with a solution and it worked. If you want more tips, go and speak to John in Hong Kong, or someone else. They're thinking about taking it across into a global initiative, but in terms of how it's working with APAC, it's been brilliant. Not making everything a huge challenge of, oh my goodness, how is my job? I'm not going to hit my sales target. what on earth am I meant to do? And just making sure that people see there are ways of keeping on making an impact. Just, for them, it's keeping those doctor relationships alive throughout this, whilst they can't go and knock on sort of, doctors' doors and show them the latest pen that might be branded with said drug.
That's a great point. So our next question is perhaps a bit more personal, and it's a question on onboarding, or rather a lack of. How can I approach my new employer to discuss the lack of company onboarding? Would anyone like to take this?
Amanda, I'm happy to talk about this because I feel that as recruiters that place people into your firms, obviously it's in our interest as well that people are onboarded efficiently. And I think this has been a concern actually before COVID kicked off, but clearly is even so important now. And obviously, as Ian was saying, we should be onboarding current and past employees. I don't know if this is a personal comment or not, but if it is, I think you need to go to your employer and ask the questions. If they are not giving it to you and they are not giving you an onboarding program, then you need to go and ask for it. Because if you do not know what success looks like in your company, you are just going to fail, sadly. So I would just grab the bull by the horns and go and ask your managing director or your CEO / HR about the onboarding program. And I think you do need to be proactive about it. Managing your career is down to you as well as your employer. So my advice would be to be proactive with this. If you're not satisfied with what's happening, to go and ask for help and to ask for support and to ask for a mentor. And keep asking until you get what you want.
And to the person who posted this question, if you want any more tips or advice, you can reach out to Emma or myself, and we'll be more than happy to share with you. So on to our next question to the panelists. So you cautioned against simulating life before COVID when planning the return to the office, and talked about the social contract between employers and employees changing. Have you come across examples of organizations that have or are making this transition mindfully? So it sounds like companies who are doing this well.
Yeah, there are a lot of organizations who are doing this well. I think, to be specific, and to give you one example, I'm not going to name the organization, but they have put, it's actually the same company that's really or one of them that's investigating the purpose of the office and running a big project around that. I think what's really interesting about the work that they do is the amount of increased investment in terms of time and to some degree capital around sustainability and their contribution to the community. Because what they've recognized is that it was a long-standing commitment that they made. It's deeply entrenched in their employee value proposition as far as their contribution to community in which they live and work. And it's something that the employee base has come to expect of them. And, if you kind of look at the macro discussion around climate change, it's gone a lot quieter than perhaps it was 3 or 4 months ago. And in some respects, at a micro level, the same has happened with some organizations as well. And that's dangerous, and it's difficult, because I think that employees expect, they recognize that this is a period that we are going through, an extremely difficult period that we are going through, but there is a long-term obligation that organizations have to the communities and societies in which they work, and that obligation is being driven by employee expectation, both of existing and future talent as well. So for me, in terms of what's an example of this, it's that whole area of ensuring that you do not forget the commitments that you've made, whatever commitments they might be, but you follow through on those, and particularly with these macro issues, you don't let something like COVID, as complex as it is, divert your attention away from that, because if you do, then your entire EVP, your entire employee value proposition begins to crumble as well, and that creates even bigger problems down the line.
Emma, did you want to add to that?
No, I'm
I
just
see you
nodding in
nodding.
agreement. Marina might have a more specific example. I haven't seen yet a firm example of people changing. If the social contract is also thinking about the changing work environment for an individual, I think that will come. But we're definitely seeing the great companies are treating this as a crisis, and it might be quite an ongoing crisis, but they're also making sure they're staying, they're keeping their eye on the 5-year commitments, the 10-year commitments that they've made. Very much sort of echoing Ian's point there.
Marina, did you want to add, or shall we go on to the last question?
I mean, I think that I'll just be quick here. I think in terms of being mindful, once again, is just that everyone's got a different level of comfort. It's for organizations to maintain flexibility and to be able to continue to provide an inclusive workplace, and whether it's remote or back to work, just to be mindful of the differences for all the people is quite important.
Great. So final question from Shadidit. Thanks for the question. And he's asking, how can a comms professional who is now playing a stronger business role, how can we become a member of the board rather than just a senior advisor to the CEO? Would anyone like to weigh in on this interesting question?
Emma Dale might be the right person to do this. I will. First of all, there's a big difference usually between the board, right, and the executive team. So the board being an advisory body of specialists, where the executive team is obviously running the organization. What's important here is that the role of the communications manager, director, whoever it may be, has, I think, really elevated in this particular period. I think most CEOs and management teams have recognized the importance of what is said and how it's said and how often it is said as well. Not just because people are not in the office environment, but it just is, it's such a profoundly important area. I know I'm preaching to converted on this particular discussion, but I'm have already seen a couple of examples actually of where that role that the comms lead plays has been recognized, if you will, within the organizational structure. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the comms person is going to be heading to the board, but I think certainly the comms individual heading into a more formal role in the executive structure has happened. The other thing, which is, I will say this very quickly, that I've seen related to this, is the shift in relationship between the transformation director, HR director, and comms director. And there is a real alignment now between those three particular roles. And some of them are reporting to each other, but more often not, it's that kind of triumvirate, if you will. And so I don't think it's just about the comms person heading to executive level, if they're not there already. But I think that it's HR and it's transformation, if indeed they're not there already.
Thank you, Ian.
Maybe I should just add then, from my perspective, I think this has always been a question as to will comms get a seat at the table, and is a concern to many. And to be honest with you, I think it's getting better and better each year. I think we are seeing communications directors as part of, probably, as Ian was saying, more the executive team, maybe than necessarily a board position. But I think, if anything, comms is right up there at the moment in terms of a priority for a CEO. So if any time this is going to happen, I should think it will be now.
Let me offer one small piece of advice to Saidid, who asked that question. And I think that if the essence of that question was, how do you move in that direction? And I sense it possibly was, eventually. What I would encourage you and others to do is to look at the charity sector. The giving sector, the charity sector, is in desperate need of support right now. They've seen a crash in the amount of contribution, and charity bodies whatever they may be, whether it be in healthcare charities or other such areas, are in desperate need of strong and insightful advice from communications professionals. There is an innate opportunity for individuals to both make a contribution to those sorts of organizations, but to also hone your skills in how you work with senior people, in this instance in fundraising. So, you know, it's a kind of in addition to your role, but I think perhaps just as a practical bit of career advice, if I dare do that in Emma's company, I think that's something you might want to consider.
Fantastic. I think those are all our questions now, Amanda, so thank you so much for that. And I'm very aware of the time. So thank you so much, Marina, Ian and Emma, for giving us up your time. I think that's been a great discussion. I know that Tara at the PRCA has recorded this, and for those who weren't able to come onto the call, we'll be able to download it. But thank you very, very much, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Ian, Marina,
Thanks,
everybody on the
everyone.
line.
Likewise. Thanks all. Thanks for hosting, Emma.